invite our first speaker, Professor Roger Kangas, who is the Academic Dean and Professor of Central Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, U.S. Department of Defense Regional Center. Professor Roger Kangas has a very distinguished career. I wouldn't go into details, but I would say previously he served as Professor of Central Asian Studies at the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch. So he has a very distinguished academic record, and let me now invite Professor Roger Kangas to present to you. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of this group, and to KDU, honored to be part of your conference this summer. Obviously, we're addressing you virtually. We would love to be there in person. I would love to interact with colleagues in Colombo, but next year perhaps. For now, and I think because we've become quite proficient in the world of Zoom conversations and meetings, we can accomplish quite a bit here in this discussion. The panel that we're beginning and really starting off this conference, is entitled Security, Stability, and National Development. And I'm going to add a quiet rejoinder, which is the U.S. perspective on this new normal, coming at it as an American, looking at this region and looking at the challenges we have. I think it's worthwhile for me to raise, a few key issues that are shaping how and why the U.S. is approaching security the way it does. And first off, I have to say, 2021 has definitely been a strange year for the United States. The comments just made about the, collapse of the Ghani government in the past couple of weeks, and the departure of U.S. forces after nearly 20 years in Afghanistan is no question an inflection point for the U.S. But I would actually say for us, it started this year on January 6th with the failed insurrection in our own country. And that's the only way to frame it. There were Republican Party supporters of Donald Trump who, vowed to keep him in power and deny the electoral victory of President Joseph Biden. It failed, but it really opened up, and I would say exposed fissures within this country that have yet to be healed. The U.S. Is a divided space. It's had divisions in the past. We've had crises in the past. But this past year has made us think in terms of who we are as a people, who constitutes Americans, what are American values, what is American democracy. And I point to this because that is going to shape how we engage globally. And I do think that the current administration is taking a hard look at who we are and rethinking how we engage with the rest of the world. As also mentioned, throughout the year, from January to the present, we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is going, it's a multi-year event. And as noted frequently by commentators, wars, recessions, and pandemics impact countries, have an effect on what we do. Well, my goodness, we're facing all of these economic challenges, health challenges, et cetera, and of course, violence. So this is shaping how, not only the US, but the world is able to engage. Because let's be honest, the pandemic has not only had an impact on our country's health, how we conduct business within our offices and with each other, but also how we interact internationally, how we can travel, how we can communicate. It has far-reaching effects. And honestly, it will take some time for us to overcome this current pandemic. In my opinion, it will happen, but it will take time and we will see a reshaped world. And so we add all of these together, whether it's individual wars or conflicts like Afghanistan, changing US internal perceptions, and of course, global challenges. I'm not even mentioning climate change and others. And we do have to ask ourselves, is this the new normal? Is this new normal a chaotic a series of events, violent or otherwise, that are going to shape how we can engage. To an extent, yes, but in taking a step back and looking at a bigger picture, perhaps a longer term view, I'm just going to highlight two key issues and then provide the so what for our region and what this means for the US and the region. And the first is simply, we are looking at shifting power dynamics in the world because of these forces, because of countries rethinking their own position in the world. We are seeing shifts in so-called great power competition, a well-worn phrase that people love to use to describe, whether it's the US and the Soviet Union back in the day of the Cold War, or today the US and China, perhaps Russia, the European Union, other countries. I'm going to highlight, of course, regional powers, small and medium states, because one of the realities in the last really decade plus is that many states have greater senses of agency, but also greater challenges in defining and addressing their own security concerns. And if I'm looking at one part of this new normal, looking at it as an American, I would say we have to understand this shifting great power dynamic is something that we can't just assume is a static entity, but something that needs to be addressed, and at all levels and with all countries. It means that one can't go alone. There was a mantra in the past, in the US of, forging coalitions of the willing, or if you're not with us, you're against us. That sort of rhetoric rings hollow today. Quite frankly, collective action, regional efforts are going to be paramount. I'd be curious what my colleagues have to say on this. The second one, and this I'll spend a few minutes on, is how the US is rethinking things. And this US approach, I do think, is important for all of us to understand effectively how it plans to continue to engage in the region over the next number of years. Much of the language or the rhetoric around, say, the collapse of the Ghani government is, this is the end of the US. The American era is over. The US is no longer a superpower, et cetera, et cetera. I'll hear those criticisms. I think they tend to be based on partial facts. What we see is a US, as I noted, rethinking itself. I guarantee with the new administration in, less than a year, like other new administrations. This was the case with Donald Trump. This was the case with Barack Obama and others. The lion's share of his attention is on domestic politics. It's on job creation in the US. It's on healing social divisions within the United States. It, of course, is focusing on the pandemic and pandemic management. All of these issues are going to be important to the administration, and it's seized with these. So how does it draw its attention to external actors, to the region as a whole, the world as a whole? No surprise, this administration is looking at partners and allies. It is very much an orthodox approach to security and foreign policy. If you look at the initial trips the administration has made, they've been to Europe, they've been to East Asia, they've been to longer standing partners and allies. We do start to see trips now going to other parts of the world. But be clear, part of this is to shore up frayed ties that existed during the previous administration, but also addressing what I see as longer term suspicions or challenges about American staying power. So this administration is trying to, re-engage and show that it can do, the right thing with its partners and allies. Now, do I personally think that this can happen? There are many obstacles to overcome, and I do think the US does need to take seriously the negative perceptions against it, but also this shifting global environment. And it's really this shifting global environment that the US is going to focus on, the transnational threats and challenges, climate change, pandemics, international trade or trade restrictions, freedom of navigation. These are issues that are going to come up repeatedly. in talks, not just this year, but next year, the year after. Um, Specific events like the departure from Afghanistan were purposefully done. Um, I may have my own views perhaps on how that could have been handled. I think we all watched the challenges in Kabul, but at the end of the day, it was imperative that the US leave Afghanistan. Uh, this mission, at least the initial mission, was over. Other missions that were piled on were most likely not going to happen. And whether the US and NATO stayed for another 5 years, 10 years, would that have mattered? Would it have helped? Because we really had an internal challenge in Afghanistan. The government did not collapse that quickly simply because external actors were departing. It was an issue of legitimacy and it was an issue of competence and corruption. And unfortunately, some of these things are going to affect the peoples of Afghanistan in the coming years. And for that, for all those who are celebrating the emergence of the Taliban, I do worry what is going to happen in that country. Um, but that event, from the US perspective, is going to take a back seat, as have other crises in the world, whether it's Lebanon in the 80s, Somalia in the 90s, the Balkans, even the Vietnam War back, in the 1960s and 70s. There have been moments where the US was seized with certain countries and their attention was drawn there, but just as quickly they disappeared. And I do wonder if that is going to be the case. So what does all of this mean for the region? And I'll close with these sort of a few comments. The first is, of course, and I'll, one last time to say something on Afghanistan, the big challenge is going to be, how does the new administration of the Taliban become part of the international community, or will it be a pariah state as it was in the 1990s? The UN has passed resolutions demanding that there be an interim government that's inclusive. It involves minorities, religious groups, women, etc. Will we see this from the Taliban? And if not, what will the international community do? To date, they have not been inclusive, and in fact, their treatment of women, murder of folk singers, and sort of challenges to minority groups suggest that a hardline approach is going to be had there. What will the rest of the world do on this? And I think you'll find the US will be cautious in engaging. This includes, by the way, international aid and other efforts that it could bring to bear, but it may wait and see. In terms of the neighboring states, Central Asia, just to the north, I'll have to mention a few words here. Don't expect that the US is departing from Central Asia. I've heard this phrase as well. Militarily, it is playing a much less significant role. You'll see greater attention on diplomatic efforts, on economic trade, especially trans-regional trade, Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and beyond. I should add that in the coming weeks, there are significant meetings between senior security officials of Central Asia and the US. So not all ties have diminished, but expect to see perhaps a more focused approach in the region. And of course, South Asia. I can't leave without mentioning a word or two about engagement in our region. That is the focus of many in this conference. I don't think it's a surprise to say that the trajectory of US-India relations will continue. This is something that has transcended administrations, and it's interesting. The last three administrations have made claims that they were the ones that have pushed for greater engagement. But it's happened broadly across administrations and really across sectors, private industry, education, etc. Expect this to continue, but I would add, expect it to begin or continue with other states in South Asia, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh. Yes, I will even say Pakistan, with which the US has had challenged relations over the decades.
Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
The Indian Ocean space
Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
A much more important region, both because of the communities in the US, but also our economic and security ties. And so I do expect to see greater attention, but I don't expect it to be a militarized approach, nor do I expect it to be one focusing on creating alliances and larger security structures. Yes, there is the Quad, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the US. But this is more of a voluntary collective structure. And I, for one, would look to see what is Japan, what is India saying about this, not necessarily what is the US making statements on, or what do others believe the US is doing. All too often, structures like that have been elevated, I think, beyond not just their capabilities, but beyond their meaning. Um, and finally, I should add, what about the US relationship with China? I would be remiss to avoid noting something on this because it clearly shapes how people look at the region, and it has taken up more attention on the part of the US. If we're thinking of a new normal, part of it is trying to better understand this US-Chinese dynamic. And to that end, I still think, and I do believe the words when the administration and when others say, where we can work together, we will try, and where there are differences, we will minimize the conflicts or the differences. This is going to be a difficult task,
Professor
both for the
Kangas,
US and,
Professor Kangas.
but it's essential because most importantly for countries in the region, Sri Lanka included, they can't be put in a position of having to choose one or the other. Because when I look at your security challenges and dynamics in this new normal, it is also about being multi-vectored, inclusive. And that's something we all are going to have to work with. There's a lot more I could say, but time is up, and I'm more than happy to address any of the issues I've raised or issues perhaps I've not raised in our question and answer discussion. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Professor Kangas, thank you so much for your presentation. You highlighted the key issue that is being debated globally, and especially in the Asian region, which is Afghanistan, and we appreciate your point of view. I would like to add that when Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, 40 threat groups from around the world, including Al-Qaeda Central, congratulated Taliban. So certainly the world will watch whether there will be an election in Afghanistan, whether there is an inclusive government in Afghanistan, whether women's rights are protected in Afghanistan, and also whether the UN will give a seat to Afghanistan. But we thank you very much for that opening presentation of our session.